Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, we present Miss Marple and the Poison in the Butter Churn, a Miss Marple mystery story. The village of St. Mary Mead rests in a gentle hush, hedgerows neat, kettle singing, and the air sweet with cream. A simple churn turns in a quiet dairy, yet a darker current moves beneath the surface, patient as nightfall. Miss Marple sits with her knitting and a mind bright as morning frost. She knows the habits of people, their small kindnesses and their careful lies. She watches the tilt of a teacup, the pause before an answer, the way a neighbour crosses a lane when no one is looking. In her calm gaze a pattern forms, stitch by careful stitch. Politeness covers fear, friendship masks resentment, and a single bitter note in a village breakfast begins to sing of harm. Settle close to the light and listen. Let the village speak in soft voices, and let the truth gather itself like cream rising in a jar. And now, dear listener, we turn to Chapter 1, where our mystery properly begins. Chapter 1. The Morning at Old Dairy Lane. The morning began with soft light along Old Dairy Lane. Mist lifted from the fields. Cows moved lazily toward the milking sheds. The butter room smelled of salt and cream, bright and clean. Mrs. Pargeter stood at the churn with a brisk air. She had tied a blue scarf over her hair. The paddle turned in patient circles. A clock ticked by the window with a dry sound. Elsie wiped the marble table and stacked the moulds. She hummed a little hymn. The tune kept time with the churn. The rhythm pleased her and steadied her hands. Miss Marple arrived with a small basket of scones. She came by on her daily walk. The path was muddy along the ditch. She tapped her shoes clean on the step. Mrs. Pargeter smiled, though her eyes looked tired. She thanked Miss Marple for the scones. She said the morning orders were large. The grocer had asked for extra pats. Miss Marple laid the basket down and folded her gloves. She praised the butter for its colour. She said it looked like sunshine in a bowl. Elsie blushed with quiet pride. A jar of cream sat near the window. Its surface held a faint ring. Miss Marple glanced at it and moved on. She picked a breadcrumb from the counter and nodded. Mrs. Pargeter lifted a small spoon to taste the fresh churn. She paused, then tasted again with a frown. She said the flavour ran oddly sharp. Elsie looked at her with concern. Miss Marple accepted a sliver on the knife. She touched it to her tongue and listened to her own scents. The taste held a bitter trace that did not belong. She set the knife down gently. A quiet breeze crept in and stirred the curtain. The scent of hay drifted through the room. Behind it lay a faint almond note. Miss Marple's eyes clouded as if with thought. Elsie fetched a clean plate and cut another pat. She said perhaps the salt had been mismeasured. Mrs. Pargeter shook her head. She knew her work and trusted her hands. Miss Marple asked for the salt tin and weighed it in her palm. The crystals looked ordinary and clean. She tasted a grain and waited. Her face remained calm and unreadable. Mrs. Pargeter spoke of the grocer's new discount. She said it brought the rival dairy to the fore. There had been sharp words last week. She shrugged and said, "Business was business," Miss Marple asked after the well on the back path. She had heard it was low. Mrs. Pargeter said the pump was slow this month. Elsie said the water tasted chalky again. Miss Marple looked at the churn rim and the drain spout. She noted a pale smear near the latch. She asked if anyone had cleaned it. Elsie said she had done so at dawn. Mrs. Pargeter fetched the ledger and ran a finger down. She counted the jars delivered yesterday. She frowned again at a scratched figure. She said someone had rubbed the page. Miss Marple asked who had visited that afternoon. Mrs. Pargeter named 2 housewives and a postman. Elsie added that Mr. Giles had dropped by. He had admired the equipment. Mrs. Pargeter laughed without warmth. She said the visiting chemist liked to inspect things. He had asked about cooling times and storage. He had peered at the thermometer very closely. Miss Marple accepted the ledger and studied the margin. Ink blotted near a crossed-out entry. A faint, oily fingerprint rested beside it. She closed the book with a thoughtful smile. Elsie opened the pantry and brought out a clean cloth. She wiped the churn handle again. She said she wanted everything tidy for the inspector visit next month. Standards mattered to her. Mrs. Pargeter poured tea and stirred carefully. She offered cups to her guests. Miss Marple took sugar and a slice of lemon. Mrs. Pargeter drank plain and sat very still. Miss Marple said the butter might need testing. She spoke mildly as if of weather. She suggested keeping this batch aside. She asked Elsie to label it clearly and note the time. Elsie wrote the hour on a card and pinned it to the pat. She set it in the cool room. She promised to start a fresh churn at once. Mrs. Pargeter thanked her softly. A cart rattled on the lane beyond the window. The sound faded under the steady churn. Sunlight came in a pale square upon the floor. Dust motes drifted like lazy snow. Miss Marple stood and moved toward the door. She said she would consult Dr. Haydock. She called it a precaution. She did not wish to alarm anyone. Mrs. Pargeter lifted her chin and smiled. She said she had weathered many village squalls. Butter had its moods like people. She would not be frightened by a taste. Miss Marple touched the edge of the door and paused. Her eyes returned to the cream jar near the window. A thin ring still marked the glass. She nodded to herself and left. Clue 1 came in the lightest form. A bitter almond scent behind the honest smell of cream. It lingered like a whispered word. Miss Marple carried it away in silence. The lane turned toward the churchyard yews. Miss Marple walked with careful steps. The morning had brightened. The village roofs shone like wet slate. She stopped at her gate and looked back. The dairy door now sat slightly ajar. Elsie had propped it open for the breeze. Miss Marple thought of air and hands and habit. She entered her cottage and set the kettle on. Her sitting room held clean order. A pot of geraniums flushed by the window. On the table lay a small notebook and pencil. She wrote 3 words. Bitter almond note. She added a question mark beside water. She underlined the word ledger and waited for the kettle to sing. There came a knock. Elsie stood on the path with a shawl. She had run over in haste. Her cheeks were flushed and her eyes anxious. Miss Marple brought her in and poured tea. Elsie said the second churn tasted normal. She said Mrs. Pargeter asked her to deliver a fresh pat to the grocer. Miss Marple listened and nodded. Elsie lowered her voice. She said the grocer had visited before dawn. She had seen his bicycle by the hedge. He had said he wanted an early order. He had left very quickly. Miss Marple asked whether he came inside. Elsie said he waited by the door. Mrs. Pargeter had handed him a wrapped pat. Elsie had fetched more paper and twine from the pantry. Miss Marple asked about keys and locks. Elsie said the dairy locked at night. The spare key hung on a hook in the kitchen. Mrs. Pargeter kept it near the back door. They finished their tea and stepped outside. Miss Marple's garden held a neat border. Bees drifted among the lavender. The air felt clean after the dairy's thick scent. Miss Marple thanked Elsie and sent her back. Then she walked to Dr. Haydock's surgery. She greeted him with a calm smile. She asked if he might test a small sample. He agreed with brisk kindness. He said he would send it to the lab. He looked concerned when she described the taste. He said caution would be wise. Miss Marple returned to Old Dairy Lane. The cart stood again near the hedge. The grocer's boy spoke with Mrs. Pargeter. He laughed and swung his cap in the air. Miss Marple paused by the gate and watched. Mrs. Pargeter paid the boy and turned away. The boy tucked a paper into his pocket. He cycled off with a jangling bell. Miss Marple entered the butter room and greeted Mrs. Pargeter. She said the doctor would arrange testing. Mrs. Pargeter looked relieved. She said the second batch tasted sound. Miss Marple moved to the window and lifted the cream jar. She tipped it slightly and looked at the ring. She smelled the rim and set it down. Her expression did not change. Elsie came in with twine marks on her fingers. She said the pantry shelf had a new stain. She could not remove it with vinegar. Mrs. Pargeter frowned and told her to try soda. Miss Marple asked where the stain lay. Elsie described the back corner by the salt tin. She said it looked like a thin varnish. It had dried into a pale crust. Miss Marple walked to the pantry and bent slightly. The shelf held neat rows of jars. The stain lay like a dull crescent. She ran a fingertip near it without touching. Beside the stain, a tiny paper scrap clung to the wood. The corner showed a printed R and a number. Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Pargeter. She asked if they used printed labels. Mrs. Pargeter shook her head. She said they wrote their own with pencil. Miss Marple lifted the scrap with a butter knife and laid it on a saucer. She asked Elsie to keep it safe. Mrs. Pargeter sighed and rubbed her hands. She said the rival dairy had accused her of short weight. She said the grocer enjoyed stirring village talk. Miss Marple made a soothing sound. Inspector Cray appeared in the doorway with his hat in hand. He said he had heard a concern about taint. He asked if he might look about. Mrs. Pargeter waved him in. He asked simple questions and wrote in a small book. He spoke gently to Elsie. He asked about visitors and times. He asked who had handled the salt tin. Miss Marple watched the inspector's pencil stop. She said the ledger showed a rubbed figure. She suggested it be kept safe. Inspector Cray nodded and asked to see it. Mrs. Pargeter fetched the book and handed it over. He traced the page with a blunt finger. He said the rubbing might hide an extra jar. Miss Marple watched his brows draw in. He closed the ledger and looked at the churn. He asked who had cleaned the rim today. Elsie said she had done so at dawn. He asked if anyone else had touched it. She said no. Clue 2 sat on a pantry shelf. A dried varnish ring and a printed scrap. Neither belonged in a dairy. They waited like shy witnesses for a patient mind. Inspector Cray thanked them and left. Mrs. Pargeter sat down with folded hands. Her face looked older in the quiet. Elsie stood beside her like a worried child. Miss Marple spoke of rest and clear heads. She said they should keep the first batch separate. She asked Elsie to note every visit today. She asked for times and names and small remarks. Elsie brought a notebook and wrote neatly. She recorded the grocer's boy and his joke. She noted the chemist's questions yesterday. She added a housewife asking for extra salt. Miss Marple listened to the pencil scratch. She asked about the back door latch. Elsie said it stuck after rain. She said one had to lift and pull with a twist. Miss Marple said she would walk the yard. She stepped outside into the pale sun. The pump creaked with a heavy sound. Water fell into the trough in a slow thread. She leaned to the well curb and looked down. The rope smelled of damp iron. A small cork bobbed in the trough. She picked it up and turned it in her hand. She returned to the butter room and set the cork down. She said the yard showed nothing strange. She suggested keeping the bucket lids tight. She asked Elsie to sweep the step again. Mrs. Pargeter rose with a straighter back. She thanked Miss Marple for her care. She said she would not be beaten by a flavour. She smiled, though her eyes still held worry. Clue 3 slipped in with the ledger. A rubbed figure near an oily print. It hinted at someone counting what should not be counted. It asked for a wary heart. Miss Marple tied on her gloves and prepared to go. She said she would return this afternoon. She would bring word from the doctor. She would also bring more labels. Elsie escorted her to the lane. She said she would scrub the shelf once more. She would watch the pantry keys. She would keep the first pat untouched. Miss Marple walked toward the church. Bells would soon call the hour. The breeze lifted her scarf and settled it again. Her steps remained unhurried and sure. She thought of the almond scent behind the honest cream. She thought of a varnish stain that refused vinegar. She thought of a number rubbed thin in a book. Clue 4 came quietly with the cork. It had no bottle to claim it. It lay in a trough as if forgotten. She tucked it into her pocket for later thought. Chapter 2. The Vicarage Garden Party. The morning of the garden party arrived with soft skies and the scent of mown grass. The vicarage lawn stretched wide and green, trimmed by neat hedges and a row of fluttering bunting. Tables stood dressed in white cloths. Teapots gleamed like small suns in the pale light. Miss Marple arrived early, walking slowly with her parasol. She greeted the Reverend Clement with her calm smile. He thanked her for helping with the tombola prizes. The air was bright with chatter, the hum of bees, and the faint sound of the band tuning near the gazebo. Mrs. Price Ridley presided over the cake table with importance. Her niece Nora helped by arranging sponge slices into even lines. Mrs. Hartnell fussed with her hat. The grocer and his wife poured lemonade for children. Everyone seemed to talk at once, yet all in that village way, half gossip, half courtesy. Miss Marple took a chair beneath the elm tree. She unfolded her gloves and placed them in her lap. Her knitting bag rested by her side. She watched the lanes of movement across the lawn, how each person turned and paused with purpose, how eyes met and turned away again. Mr. Giles, the visiting chemist, appeared near the refreshments tent. His coat was dark, though the day was warm. He moved with quick steps, stopping to speak with Mrs. Pargeter, who looked drawn but determined. He asked questions about the dairy stall she had helped arrange for the fete. She replied politely, though Miss Marple noted the stiffness in her tone. The butter display stood beneath a shaded awning. A small churn gleamed beside pats of gold wrapped in paper. Elsie, still pale from the morning's work, stood ready with a smile. She called out the prices in a clear voice. Children watched her work, the small demonstration churn, fascinated by the slow, thickening cream. Miss Marple rose and walked nearer. She saw Mr. Giles lean toward the churn, murmuring something to Elsie. His voice carried no farther than his own coat collar. She saw his hand rest briefly on the churn lid, fingers pressing the latch before withdrawing. He smiled and thanked her for the explanation. A clue flickered like light through leaves. Miss Marple saw the faint stain on Mr. Giles's cuff. It matched the pale varnish mark from the dairy shelf. She turned away, pretending to study the flower arrangements. Reverend Clement called for quiet as the raffle began. The crowd gathered near the stage. Children sat on the grass. The sound of paper rustling and polite laughter floated through the air. Miss Marple clapped softly when Mrs. Price Ridley won the hamper of preserves. Afterward, people drifted again. Conversations resumed in low voices. Mrs. Pargeter joined Miss Marple by the tea urn. She spoke of the butter sample Dr. Haydock was testing. She hoped for results soon. Miss Marple listened, eyes kind but thoughtful. A slight breeze lifted the corner of the tablecloth. A cup tipped, spilling tea upon the grass. Miss Marple steadied it and noticed a faint scent rising in the steam. Almond again, though faint and fleeting. She said nothing. She only watched Mr. Giles take another cup and add 2 sugars. Elsie approached to ask permission to leave early. Mrs. Pargeter nodded, saying she should rest. The girl's face looked pale, her hands trembled. She glanced once more at the chemist before hurrying away toward the gate. Miss Marple's eyes followed her. The party continued, laughter easy again, music swelling from the gazebo. Yet beneath it ran a thread of unease. The butter, the almond scent, and the chemist's careful hands tied themselves into a quiet knot of suspicion. Clue 1 of the day had arrived unseen by most, a cuff mark of varnish and the shadow of a sweet, dangerous smell. The afternoon wore on. The sun fell low behind the church tower. Shadows stretched across the vicarage lawn. Guests drifted toward the refreshment tables one last time before departure. Miss Marple joined Reverend Clement near the rose beds. They spoke of the coming harvest and the school fund. She asked gently whether he knew much about the chemist, Mr. Giles. The Reverend said the man had taken rooms at the inn, claiming to research rural food standards. He seemed pleasant, though rather secretive about his work. Miss Marple nodded. Her fingers toyed with a loose thread on her cuff. She said it was kind of him to show such interest in village produce. She remarked that his hands were often stained with ink or perhaps chemical residue. The Reverend laughed softly, saying such was the mark of learning. Nearby, Mrs. Pargeter sat with Mrs. Hartnell. Their voices carried faintly. Mrs. Pargeter spoke of the rival grocer again, the one who spread word of her poor butter. She said she meant to win the village back with honesty and taste. Her face looked flushed, her teacup full but untouched. Miss Marple drifted toward the tea table once more. She lifted a small plate and noticed faint powder on its edge. She brushed it with her handkerchief, leaving no trace. She said to herself that care and quiet watching would serve better than haste. Mr. Giles reappeared at the far end of the lawn, speaking to Inspector Cray, who had come in plain clothes. They spoke briefly, the inspector polite, the chemist serious. The tone looked civil, yet Miss Marple noted how Mr. Giles's hand tightened around his hat brim. A clue shimmered in that gesture. Fear had touched him. The polite mask slipped for a heartbeat before it returned. As guests began to leave, Miss Marple helped fold napkins and tidy the tables. She moved without hurry, her mind steady. She asked Reverend Clement if she might keep a few empty jars from the butter display for her rose cuttings. He agreed with a smile. She wrapped them neatly in paper. Mrs. Pargeter approached to say good night. Her face had softened, but fatigue shadowed her eyes. She thanked Miss Marple for her kindness. She said the day had gone well enough, though she would sleep better once the tests were done. Miss Marple squeezed her hand gently. When most had gone, she sat alone under the elm tree. The band packed away their instruments. The air smelled of trampled grass and cooling tea. She looked toward the empty churn under the awning. The lid rested slightly open. A drop of pale liquid hung on its rim. She rose and closed the lid with a calm hand. She turned toward the gate and walked home along the lane. The sound of crickets rose in the hedges. At her cottage, she set the empty jars on her table. She washed them carefully, drying each one. In the bottom of one jar, she found a faint film, smooth and colourless. She held it to the lamp. It caught the light with a dull sheen. She wrote a note for Inspector Cray and sealed the jar in paper. Then she sat in her chair and knitted, her mind turning as evenly as her needles. She thought of the chemist's quiet questions, the varnish stain on his cuff, and the almond trace in the tea steam. She thought of Mrs. Pargeter's trembling hand and Elsie's hurried steps. 4 threads, neat and strong, wound toward the same center. The Butter Churn had begun the tale, but the poison story was still half told. The clock in her room struck 7. The sound was calm and patient. Miss Marple folded her knitting and smiled faintly to herself. Clue 2 of the day rested under her lamp, sealed in a simple jar. Chapter 3. A Death in the Village. Morning settled over St. Mary Mead with a pale, thoughtful light. Sparrows hopped along garden walls. The milk cart rattled by the green, steady and familiar. Houses opened their doors to tea and toast. News travelled faster than cart. Mrs. Pargeter had been found in her kitchen after breakfast. Elsie ran for the doctor with a face drained of colour. Dr. Haydock came at once and sent for Inspector Cray. Miss Marple, already at her gate, saw Elsie pass like a frightened shadow. She followed at a sensible pace. Her steps were neither hurried nor slow. Her mind held to simple order. The cottage kitchen looked tidy, as Mrs. Pargeter kept it. The butter dish sat near the toast rack. A thin knife lay across the plate. A brown ring of tea marked the cloth. Dr. Haydock raised his head with a grave look. He said the matter would need formality. He asked Miss Marple to wait by the scullery door. She agreed, and watched quietly from there. Inspector Cray arrived with 2 constables. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod. He moved with steady care, asking brief questions. He crouched to examine the butter dish and the cup. Elsie stood near the dresser, trembling. She said Mrs. Pargeter had eaten a slice of toast with butter. She had taken tea without sugar. She had laughed at a sparrow on the sill. Miss Marple listened to the words and watched the hands. Elsie clutched her apron hem. Her right hand bore a faint stain, pale and stubborn. It circled the thumb like a faded ring. Cray asked about visitors. Elsie named none for the morning. The grocer's boy had left a parcel at the step. He had not come inside. The parcel lay unopened by the stool. Miss Marple asked softly for a cloth. She dampened it and wiped the tea ring. The stain lightened but did not vanish. She lifted the cloth to the light and studied the weave. She set the cloth down and turned to the window. A cream jar stood on the sill. Condensation haloed the glass. Inside, the surface showed a faint, wavering sheen. Dr. Haydock stood. He said the signs were troubling. He would need the cup, the butter, and the jar. He would also need to speak with Miss Marple. She inclined her head in calm assent. Mrs. Price Ridley appeared at the door with a gasp. She began to speak of debts and poor management. Inspector Cray raised a hand.
He said this was not the time.
She retreated, flustered but curious. Miss Marple asked Elsie to sit. She poured water and offered the glass. Elsie drank and steadied her breath. She said Mrs. Pargeter had planned an early delivery. The grocer had pressed for more pats. Cray lifted the butter dish and sniffed. His face did not change, but he closed the lid. He asked about the salt tin. Elsie pointed to the shelf. The tin sat far from the stove, clean and bright. Miss Marple asked if a new pat had been cut. Elsie said yes, the first pat from the morning. She pointed to the dish. Miss Marple nodded and looked at the toast crumbs. They were small and neat, as if carefully spread. Clue 1 rested in a simple difference. The butter knife bore a smear near the handle, not the blade. A right-handed woman would not usually leave it there. Miss Marple noted the oddity without a word. Dr. Haydock packed the cup and dish. He sealed them with calm hands. He asked Miss Marple to accompany him later. He valued her memory for small order. She agreed to come by at noon. Cray stepped outside with Elsie to the yard. Miss Marple remained in the kitchen. She looked at the floor by the table leg. A faint droplet had dried into a cloudy mark. She leaned to the windowsill and touched the jar rim with her eyes. A tiny nick marked the glass. It showed recent contact with something harder than porcelain. She let the moment settle. Mrs. Pargeter's cat, a slow creature, wound about Miss Marple's ankles. Miss Marple bent to stroke its back. The animal sniffed the butter dish and turned away. She watched the whiskers wrinkle. Cray returned and thanked Miss Marple for waiting. He said the back door latch was sticky. He asked if she had known that. She said yes, one must lift and pull with a twist. Clue 2 whispered from the latch itself. Dried residue darkened the metal near the screw head. It had the same dull sheen as the pantry stain. Habit had met tampering in that place. Miss Marple stepped to the doorway and looked over the yard. The pump stood still. A small cork lay on the bench by the scullery door. She remembered the cork in her pocket at home. She turned back to the kitchen and faced Elsie. She spoke gently of rest and courage. Elsie nodded and cried once, then pressed her lips thin. She said she would help in any way. Cray decided to walk the lane and question neighbours. Dr. Haydock would take the samples. Miss Marple asked if she might straighten a few things. Cray consented with a grateful look. She folded the damp cloth and rinsed the basin. She placed the knife on the dresser. She carried the butter dish to the cool pantry, then paused. She held. The lane outside gathered murmurs like leaves. Word of death drew voices to corners. Curtains lifted and settled. The village prepared its tide of opinions. Miss Marple walked to the vicarage first. Reverend Clement received her with sorrowed courtesy. She spoke softly of Mrs. Pargeter's kindness. He agreed and promised to visit Elsie later. She asked about Mr. Giles. The Reverend said the chemist had left the party early yesterday. He had returned to the inn with his notebooks. He had paid his bill for 2 more nights. Miss Marple thanked him and continued to the inn. The landlord polished glasses and spoke of quiet business. Mr. Giles had asked for hot water and a tray late at night. He had also requested a small bottle to be brought to his room. She asked whether the bottle had a label. The landlord paused and frowned. He said no, it was a plain bottle from the back shelf. He had noticed no smell. He had wrapped it carefully in paper. Miss Marple nodded and stepped outside. She stood in the shade and watched the square. The grocer crossed with a parcel under his arm. He tipped his hat with a practised smile. She asked after his health and spoke of the morning's sadness. He offered neat sympathy. He said he had always supported the dairy. He said the rival claims were never his doing. She asked whether he had called at Mrs. Pargeter's this morning. He said no, the boy did the round. He said the lad had strict orders not to go inside. He folded the parcel closer to his side. He asked whether Dr. Haydock would finish testing soon. Miss Marple said the doctor worked as fast as care allowed. The grocer nodded and moved away, still smiling. Clue 1 of the afternoon showed itself in habit. The grocer carried the parcel with the label turned inward. He did not like others to read what he held. Secrecy walked before courtesy. Miss Marple visited Mrs. Price Ridley next. The parlour smelled of polish and pride. Conversation turned quickly to debts and village standards. Miss Marple listened and counted the sharp edges. She asked whether Mrs. Price Ridley had visited the dairy yesterday. The lady coloured faintly and said no. She said her niece Nora had borrowed sugar from a neighbour instead. She spoke too quickly for comfort. Nora came in with the tray and set it down. Her eyes did not meet Miss Marple's. Her hands placed cups with careful precision. She asked if the vicarage party had pleased everyone. Miss Marple complimented the cakes and watched Nora's shoulders ease. She asked about the locked pantry door at Mrs. Price Ridley's house. Nora's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer. She said the door swelled in damp weather. Clue 2 of the afternoon lived in the sound of china. Fear travels through fingertips before it reaches the tongue. Miss Marple carried the sound away like a folded note. She left the house and walked toward her cottage. The hedges rustled with sparrows. The afternoon had warmed and softened. Bees worked the lavender with serious intent. Inspector Cray waited at her gate. He held his notebook in a steady expression. He said the latch residue matched the pantry stain. He said the doctor feared cyanide. His voice was low and measured. Miss Marple nodded once, as if at old news. She said Mr. Giles had taken a plain bottle last night. She said the grocer hid labels as a habit. She said Nora shook when pantries were named. Cray wrote a line and closed the book. He asked what she would advise. She said patience and 3 questions. Who had access to the jar? Who knew the back latch? Who could turn village talk to profit? They walked together to the dairy. The yard stood quiet, the pump still again. Inside, Elsie had tidied the room. The first pat remained wrapped and labelled. A second pat sat beside it, clean and firm. Miss Marple asked Elsie about the cream jar on the sill. Elsie said she had refilled it last night for the morning churn. She had sealed it with a strip of paper and a bit of paste. The seal lay broken now. Cray bent to the sill and found a faint paste line. He looked up at Miss Marple. She looked back without triumph. She asked whether anyone else had used the jar. Elsie shook her head. Clue 3 of the afternoon rested in the broken seal. Tampering had chosen the simplest path. A quiet hand had slipped where trust stood guard. Miss Marple asked to see Mrs. Pargeter's ledger. Elsie brought it, clean and guarded. Miss Marple turned to the rubbed figure. She held the page at an angle to the light. Letters rose faintly from the scuffed paper. A second delivery recorded and then disguised. The initials beside it were not Mrs. Pargeter's neat hand. They were squared and heavy. Cray compared the strokes to a receipt in his pocket. He lifted the receipt from the grocer. The letters leaned the same way. The initials matched with stubborn likeness. Clue 4 of the afternoon settled like a stone. The ledger spoke more plainly than people. It noted profit taken from confusion, and confusion shaped by design. Elsie sat down and covered her face. Miss Marple touched her shoulder with a kind hand. She said the truth would steady soon. She said fear would lose ground when names were set straight. Cray put away his book and thanked them. He would speak with Mr. Giles and the grocer. He would ask the innkeeper for his bottle inventory. He would ask Nora why pantries stirred her hands. Miss Marple stood at the door and looked at the lane. The day had thinned to a pale gold. Swifts cut the sky in clean arcs. She thought of kindness and care and the smallest choices. Mrs. Pargeter had kept a tidy kitchen and a brave face. The village would now carry both as memory. Miss Marple would carry the pattern behind them. It grew clearer with each quiet step. Chapter 4. The Chemist's Notebook. Rain washed the village roofs in a soft curtain. The lane shone with a dull silver. The inn windows threw warm light into the damp street. Inside, the air smelled of coal and stew. Inspector Cray sat at a corner table with his notebook. He waited with steady patience. Miss Marple faced him, hands folded near a cup of tea. Her eyes held a mild brightness. Mr. Giles arrived with a brief nod to the landlord. His coat hung wet from the walk. He took a seat with careful posture. He said he would be glad to help. Cray asked about his notebook from the fete. He said it had gone missing after the raffle. Mr. Giles frowned and spoke of clumsy pockets. He said the loss troubled him greatly. Miss Marple watched his hands as he spoke. A faint line of varnish still edged his cuff. Ink dotted his fingertips like small stars. His breath shortened at each question. Cray asked what the notes had contained. Mr. Giles described test ideas for dairy safety. He mentioned temperature logs and salt measurements. He spoke of common adulterants in urban markets. Miss Marple stirred her tea once. She asked whether he had written supplier names. Mr. Giles paused and smiled. He said such names did not matter in village notes. Elsie arrived at the doorway, uncertain. She carried a cloth parcel tied with string. The landlord showed her in. She held the parcel tight against her apron. Miss Marple welcomed her and asked if she felt steady. Elsie nodded and unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a small ledger book and 2 folded papers. Her eyes did not lift. She said she had found them in the Fate storeroom. They lay behind a wooden crate of posters. She said she thought they belonged to Mr. Giles. Cray reached for the book. Mr. Giles leaned forward with sudden interest. He said he was most relieved. He thanked Elsie for her honesty. His hand moved too quickly toward the spine. Cray kept the book on the table. He opened it with measured care. He turned the pages and scanned the entries. His finger stopped at a torn edge. Miss Marple took one folded paper. She held it at the lamp. It showed a receipt for glassware and labels. At the bottom was a note for one small bottle. The ink had blurred in a drop. Cray asked about the missing page. Mr. Giles said it contained nothing useful. He said it could have fallen at the Fate. His voice stayed even, yet his eyes shifted. Miss Marple looked down at the ledger margin. Impressions shadowed the paper beneath the tier. She produced a stub of pencil from her bag. She shaded lightly across the page. Letters rose like ghosts from the paper. A supplier code and a date appeared. A quantity stood in a neat figure. Her mouth did not move, but her eyes brightened. Clue 1 formed in quiet light. An indented note revealed a purchase of cyanide. The supplier code was clear, and the date matched the week of the Fate. Cray folded the ledger and set it aside. He asked Mr. Giles to explain the code. Mr. Giles said it was a general list number. He said it did not refer to a poison. He lifted his chin. Miss Marple lifted the second paper. It was a page of figures on cream weights. The columns bore careful sums. One line had been rubbed and rewritten. The ink on that line looked fresher. She asked whether such neatness came naturally. Mr. Giles smiled without warmth. He said precision was the soul of science. He said any error must be corrected at once. Cray shifted to the innkeeper. He asked about the bottle delivered late at night. The innkeeper repeated his earlier memory. He had seen no label. He had wrapped it and carried it upstairs. Mr. Giles said the bottle contained distilled water. He said he had meant to clean a pipette. He said the lack of label was unfortunate but innocent. His eyes met Miss Marple's and slid away. Miss Marple asked about his interest in village dairies. Mr. Giles spoke of a past slight by a city distributor. He said rural producers were often careless. He said someone must keep standards. She folded her hands and listened. She mentioned Mrs. Pargeter's kindness at the Fate. He said kindness could not replace accuracy. His words arrived smooth yet tight. Cray closed his notebook and stood. He said he would hold the ledger as evidence. He asked Mr. Giles to remain available for questions. Mr. Giles agreed with a thin smile. Miss Marple thanked Elsie and walked her to the door. The hall smelled of damp wool. Elsie's lips trembled as she spoke. She said she feared the village would blame her. Miss Marple told her to keep small courage. She said truth values steady hearts. She said fear fades when facts stand together. Elsie breathed in and nodded. On their way out, Miss Marple paused at the umbrella stand. A black umbrella leaned at an odd angle. Its ferrule wore a pale crust near the tip. She touched it with a light finger. Clue 2 perched by the doorway. A crust of varnish on the ferrule matched the pantry stain. The umbrella belonged to Mr. Giles by its stitched initials. Miss Marple and Cray stepped into the rain. The street shone and carried the inn-lights in wavering lines. They walked toward the green in even silence. Their thoughts travelled side by side. At the vicarage gate, Cray asked for her scents. She said the pattern like simple roots. The cream jar. The latch. The churn. She said a neat mind had mapped it all. They parted under the yew shade. Miss Marple walked home with her scarf held close. Her cottage windows glowed like small moons. She set the kettle on and lit the lamp. On her table, She placed the shaded page, the receipt copy, and her small cork. She laid them in a patient row. She sat quietly and let the room's warmth gather. Clue 3 settled on the table's wood. 3 small things spoke the same language. They pointed not only to guilt, but to planning. Planning had a tidy hand. Morning came with washed skies and a clear wind. The hedges rattled softly in the light. Birds cut clean lines over the roofs. The village took a deeper breath. Miss Marple visited Dr. Haydock. His rooms smelled of carbolic and tea. He moved briskly, yet his eyes showed care. He said the test strongly indicated cyanide. She thanked him and asked about delivery. He said a sealed report would go to Inspector Cray. He said discretion would be wise. He gave her a brief, sorrowed nod. From there she walked to the grocer's shop. The bell rang with a mild note. He greeted her with warm courtesy. He asked after her health and her roses. She admired his neat shelves and spoke of small economies. He praised village prudence. He turned parcels with labels inward. His hands moved with tidy secrecy. She asked for a jar of paste for sealing paper. He brought one from a high shelf. The lid rim bore a faint, dried line. The paste smelled slightly sweet when rubbed thin. Clue 1 of the day sat in her palm. The paste scent echoed the pantry crust. The grocer said he had sold several jars last week. His face stayed pleasant as polished glass. Miss Marple bought the paste and invited a remark. She spoke of the chemist's interest in weights. The grocer smiled and said accuracy served all. He wished her a very good morning. She crossed to the inn once more. In the tap room, the landlord stood by a crate. He had found a scrap of label near the umbrella stand. He offered it with a puzzled look. She accepted the scrap. A printed R and a number showed at the corner. It matched the fragment from the dairy shelf. She thanked him and slipped it into her glove. Clue 2 rode lightly in that small paper. The label belonged to a chemical supplier. It had travelled from crate to pantry. It had followed the same pair of hands. Inspector Cray joined her by the hearth. He had spoken with Mr. Giles at dawn. The chemist had grown formal and careful. He had asked for a solicitor. Miss Marple said formality often arrived late. She suggested a visit to the Fate storeroom. He agreed and fetched the keys. They left the inn together and walked under brightening clouds. The storeroom smelled of paper ink and dust. Old posters leaned in tall stacks. String hung from nails. A wooden trestle held empty jars from yesterday's display. Miss Marple moved slowly along the wall. She touched the trestle and looked beneath. A strip of cloth sagged from a nail. The cloth had a pale crescent of dried paste. Cray checked the floor. A small smear marked the boards near the door. It dulled in a half circle, as if a ferule had rested in wet varnish. He looked up and met her eyes. Clue 3 rested in plain sight. The umbrella ferule had found the floor stain. The same hand had carried paste and label through 3 rooms. Cray opened a crate with careful fingers. Inside lay folded bunting and a tin of drawing pins. Beneath them sat a small brown bottle wrapped in newspaper. He lifted it with 2 fingers. The bottle wore a torn label. The paper showed the same R and number. The cork was new and the rim bore a dull sheen. He set it on the trestle and breathed once. Miss Marple steadied the trestle with her hand. She spoke of the path from paste to jar. She spoke of the ferrying umbrella. She spoke of indented notes on a ledger page. Cray nodded and drew a slow line in his book. He asked if she believed Mr. Giles had acted alone. She considered and shook her head. She spoke of profit and village talk. They returned to the lane. The light had sharpened. Children hopped chalk squares near the green. A cart rolled by with a clink of harness. Miss Marple suggested a call on Nora. Cray agreed and led the way. They found her at Mrs. Price Ridley's parlour. She rose quickly when they entered. Her hands smoothed her skirt with anxious strokes. Miss Marple asked gently about the pantry door. Nora's eyes dropped to the carpet. She said she had fetched sugar 2 nights ago. She had also borrowed paste from the grocer. Cray asked who had sent her to the Fate storeroom. She hesitated and said Mr. Giles had asked for neat labels. He had said the vicarage display must look scholarly. She had agreed without question. Miss Marple's voice held only kindness. She asked whether Nora had seen a bottle that night. Nora nodded and began to cry. She said she carried it to the inn back door. She had not read the label. Clue 4 trembled in the girl's voice. A helper moved between rooms under instruction. She knew little, yet her path tied the lines. Fear had caught her after the news. Cray thanked Nora and promised fairness. He stepped outside to send a man to the inn. Miss Marple remained and gave the girl a handkerchief. She spoke of courage and the value of truth. When she left, the sun stood high and clear. She walked to her cottage and set the paste jar on the table. She laid the label scrap beside it. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote 4 headings: bottle, paste, umbrella, ledger. Under each heading she set 2 names. Mr. Giles wore 3 marks. The grocer touched 2. She drew a small thread between them. At the bottom she added a 5th word: motive. She wrote a line about lost contracts and stirred talk. Then she wrote a 2nd line about profit on discounted butter. She closed the book and listened to the clock. In the quiet, a picture steadied like a photograph in a tray. The edges darkened into shape. The center began to brighten. Patience would carry it to full clarity. Chapter 5. Tea with Mrs. Price Ridley. The following afternoon broke bright and dry. The storm had passed, and the village looked freshly washed. Miss Marple tied on her hat and walked the narrow lane toward the tall gates of Mrs. Price Ridley's house. The gravel drive crunched under her sensible shoes. The maid showed her into the front parlour. Lace curtains softened the light. The air smelled of polish and lavender water. Mrs. Price Ridley sat upright in a stiff chair, a silver tray before her. "My dear Miss Marple, what a pleasure," she said, though her eyes darted toward the hall. Her niece Nora came in quietly, carrying a 2nd teapot. The girl's fingers shook as she poured. Miss Marple spoke of the weather and the roses. She asked after Nora's studies. Mrs. Price Ridley replied in clipped tones about diligence and modesty. She avoided mention of the dairy or the death. Miss Marple praised the sponge cake. She said village baking rivaled any London tea room. Nora smiled faintly at the words. A small patch of flour clung to her sleeve, forgotten from some earlier task. Clue 1 rested in that dusting of flour. It was not the day for baking. Miss Marple's eyes lingered a moment, then turned back to her cup. Mrs. Price Ridley spoke of the coroner's inquiry soon to come. She said it would settle idle gossip. Her voice trembled once before she steadied it. Miss Marple asked whether the family kept old household accounts. She said she admired order and tidy records. Mrs. Price Ridley brightened and fetched a ledger from the sideboard. She spoke proudly of balanced pages. Miss Marple turned the leaves with slow care. The ink changed colour halfway through. One recent entry bore the name of the grocer, and beside it a small sum underlined twice. The amount matched that of the disputed dairy bill. Clue 2 glimmered in blue ink. The underlined figure hinted at repayment, though Mrs. Price Ridley had claimed no debt. Nora crossed the room to fetch the sugar bowl. The china lid slipped in her hand. She caught it just in time, but the tremor did not escape Miss Marple's eye. Fear spoke again through fragile porcelain. Miss Marple rose and admired the mantel photograph. One showed Nora at the fete, standing near Mr. Giles. The chemist's gaze in the picture looked fixed on the girl, not the camera. She asked about the photograph's date. Nora said quietly it was taken just before the raffle. Mrs. Price Ridley added that Mr. Giles had been helpful with the display arrangements. Miss Marple nodded and turned toward the window. The light caught a faint smudge on the sill. She touched it with her glove. It felt tacky like dried paste. She folded the glove closed without a word. Clue 3 clung to her glove. The same sweet paste smell from the grocer's jar lingered faintly on her fingers. Nora offered more tea, then excused herself to fetch biscuits. Her step quickened once out of sight. Mrs. Price Ridley spoke of her niece's delicate nerves. She said, "Tragedy unsettled the young." Miss Marple agreed kindly and asked if she might use the back corridor. She walked toward the kitchen guided by habit more than direction. The pantry door stood half open. Inside, jars lined the shelf in neat rows. One jar bore a broken paper seal. The paste label peeled at the edge, showing the same supplier code as the chemist's bottle. Miss Marple closed the door softly and returned. She thanked her hostess for tea and conversation. She said, "Village hearts healed slowly, but surely." Mrs. Price Ridley smiled, still unaware of the small truth sitting behind her pantry door. The lane outside shimmered with afternoon heat. Miss Marple walked home beneath the lime trees, her mind busy. The paste on her glove, the ledger entry, the broken seal, 3 quiet notes, forming one chord. At her cottage, Inspector Cray waited by the gate. He had spoken with Dr. Haydock again. The laboratory confirmed cyanide mixed through a layer of butter fat. The source container matched a chemical batch from Mr. Giles's order. Miss Marple invited him in and poured tea. She spoke of her visit. She mentioned the ledger entry to the grocer and the paste in the pantry. Cray wrote quickly, eyes narrowing. He said the chemist now denied ever owning the umbrella found at the inn. Miss Marple smiled gently. She said denial was often a late visitor in guilty rooms. They reviewed the chain again. The grocer supplied paste. Mr. Giles supplied poison. Nora carried sealed jars. Mrs. Price Ridley owed a quiet debt. Somewhere between kindness and fear, opportunity had ripened. Cray rose and paced the small sitting room. He asked whether Nora could have acted alone. Miss Marple shook her head. The girl had helped, not planned. She said a firmer mind had used her trust. Clue 1 of the evening sat between their cups. The ink of the ledger and the paste on the sill both tied back to the same house. A knock came at the door. Nora stood there, pale and trembling. She clutched a folded paper. She asked if they could speak privately. Miss Marple led her to the fireside chair. The girl said she could not sleep since the death. She said Mr. Giles had promised her money for errands, and her aunt had urged obedience. She said she never guessed the harm. Miss Marple listened without interruption. She asked when she last saw the chemist. Nora said 2 nights before the fete. He had given her a package to hide behind the churchyard wall, saying he would collect it later. Cray stepped closer. He asked whether she knew the package's contents. She said no, but it rattled like glass. She had feared discovery and begged her aunt to burn the paper wrapper. Miss Marple asked about the ledger entry. Nora nodded, tears rising. She said her aunt had received a small envelope the next morning. Inside was money from the grocer, passed on from Mr. Giles. Her aunt had called it settlement for cream deliveries. Clue 2 trembled in the confession. The money proved the link. Payment flowed through 2 hands to mask a single guilt. Miss Marple comforted her and spoke gently of truth's worth. She told her courage would mend what fear had frayed. Cray promised fair treatment and sent for a constable to watch the house. After Nora left, Miss Marple opened her notebook. She added a new line under motive, revenge and debt entwined. She wrote beside it, partnership of profit and pride. The room fell quiet except for the clock's ticking. Outside, the evening light cooled to gold. Miss Marple folded her hands and looked at the window, where the last ray caught her teacup rim. She thought of Mrs. Pargeter's kindness, of how greed had entered through a friendly door. She thought of Nora's shaking hands and of the chemist's smile at the fate. The pattern now stood nearly whole. Clue 3 of the night gleamed in her mind. The chemist had planned, but the village had helped in silence. Evil needed only small agreements to thrive. She rose, tidied the cups and set her knitting in her lap. Her needles clicked softly in rhythm with the settling dusk. The case was close to its heart. Chapter 6. Secrets. Beneath the churn evening mist gathered across the meadows as Miss Marple and Inspector Cray walked the path to Old Dairy Lane. The light had faded to a grey hush. The air carried the scent of hay and faint salt from the churn room. The dairy stood quiet, its windows glowing pale through the dusk. Elsie waited by the door, a shawl drawn close about her shoulders. She said she had kept everything locked, as Miss Marple advised. The key jingled faintly in her hand. Inside, the room looked spotless. The marble counter gleamed. The churn stood where it always had, heavy and dignified. Yet a strange stillness filled the air, as if the walls themselves held breath. Inspector Cray knelt to check the floor. He said the boards showed a darker mark near the drain. He touched it with his finger and smelled the faint tang of metal. Miss Marple stood by the window. Her eyes traced the familiar shapes, the jars, the tin scoop, the shelf where the first pat had rested. She said softly that evil often returns to its birthplace to tidy its traces. Elsie brought a lantern from the shelf. The light deepened every shadow. Dust motes floated through the beam like drifting thoughts. Miss Marple leaned closer to the churn. A narrow gap showed beneath the rim, no wider than a finger. She asked for a small knife. Elsie fetched one from the drawer. Miss Marple worked the edge gently along the joint. A click sounded faint but clear. Something metallic rolled out and struck the tile. It was a tiny vial, corked and sealed in wax. The glass glimmered faintly. Inside, a residue of pale powder clung to one side. Inspector Cray lifted it with a cloth and held it to the light. Clue 1 shone under the lantern. The vial bore faint chemical markings, 2 letters and a numeral, matching the code from the chemist's order. Elsie gasped and covered her mouth. Miss Marple said quietly that fear is natural when truth begins to show its face. She told the girl to fetch a tray and a clean cloth. Cray wrapped the vial and noted the position. He asked when the churn had last been scrubbed. Elsie said 2 days before the fete, under Mrs. Pargeter's instruction. Miss Marple added that Mr. Giles had stood by that very churn, asking about cooling times. She spoke gently, yet her words carried the weight of memory. The lantern flickered. A soft draught crept under the door. Elsie looked toward it and shivered. She said she had thought she heard steps last night outside the dairy. Miss Marple nodded, saying, "Guilt seldom sleeps easy." Cray turned to the wall where the ledger shelf hung. A small paper scrap clung to the back edge. He teased it free. The faint letter R showed again, the same printing as before. Miss Marple smiled sadly. She said wickedness, however clever, repeats its habits. She placed the scrap beside the wrapped vial. The pattern was now unmistakable. Clue 2 rested in repetition itself. Every act had left its twin behind. A second proof, calm and patient, waiting to be seen. Elsie sat down on a stool, pale but resolute. She said she wished to tell everything she knew. She said Nora had come here after the fete, saying she needed to collect a sample jar for Mr. Giles. She had taken the jar and left without delay. Miss Marple listened with kind eyes. She said the girl had likely been told it was for the vicarage display. She added softly that trust makes a perfect accomplice for deceit. Inspector Cray sealed the churn with a strip of tape. He said he would bring it to the station for testing. He asked Miss Marple whether she believed more poison might remain. She said she did not think so. The harm had been meant for one batch only. But she added that greed often poisons more than the butter. It seeps into hearts unnoticed. They left the dairy, locking the door behind them. The night air felt cool against their faces. The village lights winked through the mist like watchful eyes. Clue 3 lingered in the darkness of the churn. A hidden vial beneath honest cream, proof that even routine has room for treachery. Next morning, Miss Marple received a note from Inspector Cray. The laboratory confirmed the vial's residue contained cyanide crystals. The code matched precisely to Mr. Giles's supplier. She folded the paper and placed it beside her knitting. Then she wrapped a shawl and walked to the post office. On the way, she met Nora, who stood waiting by the gate, eyes rimmed red. The girl said she wished to see Miss Marple before the inspector called. She said her aunt had locked herself in the sitting room. She feared what might come next. Miss Marple led her along the path, speaking of calm and clear thought. They reached the cottage garden where bees hummed among the lavender. The scent steadied Nora's breath. Miss Marple poured tea and asked her to start from the beginning. Nora told how Mr. Giles had met her near the churchyard wall. He said the Chemists' Association wanted samples of village butter for study. He offered a £1 note for her trouble. He had given her the vial, wrapped in paper. He said to place it under the churn rim, to mix later with salt water for testing. She had done it, never thinking harm could come. Miss Marple nodded gently. She asked if her aunt knew. Nora hesitated, then said yes. Her aunt had guessed the errand, but said nothing. She had debts to pay, and Mr. Giles promised help. Clue 1 of the confession came with the word debts. Greed often wears a mask of need. Miss Marple asked whether the grocer had visited since. Nora said he had twice. He had brought envelopes both times, saying they were statements for the dairy accounts. Her aunt had burned them after reading. Miss Marple poured more tea, letting the quiet stretch. Then she said the truth would soon come through. Lies lose strength when daylight reaches them. Nora wept, but nodded, relief trembling through her voice. Inspector Cray arrived before noon. He carried a file under his arm and looked grave. He said Mr. Giles had been taken for questioning. He had admitted ordering cyanide but denied using it. He claimed to have been studying impurities in village products. Miss Marple said softly that impurities indeed had been found, but not in butter. Cray smiled faintly at the remark. He turned to Nora. He said her courage had helped more than she knew. He promised to protect her from blame. She thanked him and left, shoulders lighter than before. When they were alone, Miss Marple spoke of motive. She said Mr. Giles had once lost a city contract to Mrs. Pargeter's cousin. The man had mocked his formulas in print. Revenge had cooled over years, then found its chance through the village dairy. Cray read his notes. He said the chemist's funds came from quiet loans, repaid through small village arrangements. Mrs. Price Ridley's debt gave him the perfect door to knock upon. Clue 2 of the day connected all threads. Debt opened the way, greed held it open, and pride walked through first. Miss Marple sat by her window that evening, the sky glowing peach above the green. She thought of the churn, the vial, the paste, and the people bound by them. She picked up her knitting and smiled faintly. Evil, she thought, never hides in grand houses alone. Sometimes it lodges between a spoon and a salt tin, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Outside, the bells of St. Mary Mead began to ring for evensong. The sound floated over the cottages, pure and slow. Clue 3 of the night was simple, peace returning. The village breathed easier, though the story had not yet ended. Truth waited for one more turning of the page. Chapter 7. The Niece's Confession. The dawn rose pale above St. Mary Mead. Mist still lingered across the hedgerows, and the air smelled faintly of rain. Inside her neat cottage, Miss Marple poured tea and waited. She had asked Nora to come at first light. A timid knock sounded at the door. Nora stood there wrapped in her aunt's shawl, her face drawn but resolved. Miss Marple ushered her in, set her near the fire, and poured a second cup. For a long moment the girl said nothing. Then she whispered that she could not bear silence any more. The truth, she said, had grown too heavy to hide. Miss Marple told her to speak slowly and to begin where fear first started. Nora took a breath and said it began with the chemist, Mr. Giles, weeks before the fete. He had visited her aunt to discuss business. He said he could settle Mrs. Price Ridley's outstanding debts if she helped him obtain certain ingredients. Her aunt had refused at first, then agreed when he hinted at ruin. Nora had overheard the talk through the kitchen door. Later, Mr. Giles came alone and asked Nora to carry notes and jars between the vicarage storeroom and the dairy. He said she was helping with a demonstration on preservation. Miss Marple nodded gently. She asked whether Nora had known about the poison. Nora shook her head. She said she thought the powder kept cream from spoiling. Only later, after Mrs. Pargeter's death, did she suspect. She had wanted to tell Inspector Cray, but her aunt forbade it. Mrs. Price Ridley had accepted more money from Mr. Giles to stay quiet. Nora's voice faltered at the memory. Clue 1 shone through her confession. Innocence caught between greed and fear. moving errands without understanding their weight. Miss Marple poured more tea. She said people sometimes see only the surface of a wrong, never the full depth until it pulls them under. Nora nodded, tears running down her cheeks. Miss Marple asked how the vial came to rest under the churn. Nora said Mr. Giles gave her the bottle at dusk before the fete. He told her to slip it beneath the churn rim when no one looked. He said it contained a harmless preservative to keep the creams sweet for display. She had done as told, trembling but obedient. She had not dared to ask questions. The next day, the butter from that churn became Mrs. Pargeter's breakfast. Inspector Cray arrived soon after, his boots damp from the lane. Miss Marple greeted him and guided him to the fire. She said Nora had decided to tell everything. Cray thanked the girl with quiet courtesy. He asked who had received payment after the fete. Nora said the grocer had brought an envelope to her aunt. He had said it was from the chemist, a thank you for Erin. Her aunt had counted the notes and locked them in a drawer. Miss Marple looked at the inspector. Their eyes met, steady and sure. The chain had closed at last. Cray said the chemist had been questioned again that morning. He had admitted delivering cyanide to the village but claimed ignorance of its use. He had blamed the grocer for spreading it. Miss Marple said softly that guilty men often share their blame as easily as their goods. Cray smiled grimly and took notes. Nora asked what would happen to her aunt. Miss Marple said the law would be kind to those who told truth first. She placed her hand over the girls and said the village would forgive in time. Clue 2 lay not in the vial nor in ink, but in conscience itself. Nora's heart, once heavy, began to clear. The kettle sang softly on the hearth. Miss Marple rose and poured fresh water. She said evil often borrows gentle hands to carry its weight. She said, forgiveness begins when those hands set the burden down. Outside, church bells marked the hour. The mist began to lift. The first sunlight touched the window, warm and pure. Nora looked toward it and whispered that she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Later that day, Inspector Cray returned to the vicarage with a warrant. Miss Marple accompanied him, her knitting bag neatly folded under her arm. The air felt still as if waiting. They found Mrs. Price Ridley in her parlour. The blinds were half drawn. A teacup sat cold beside her. She looked up, startled but defiant. Cray read the warrant and spoke of aiding in the concealment of evidence. She blanched, but said she had done nothing wrong. She said she only wished to save her household from scandal. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. She asked whether the envelope of money still lay in the drawer. Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened. Cray opened the drawer. The envelope sat inside, unsealed. Inside were 5 notes and a folded paper bearing Mr. Giles's signature. Clue 1 of the arrest gleamed in that folded slip. Proof of payment for silence, not debt. Mrs. Price Ridley sagged in her chair. She said she had never meant harm. She said Giles told her the powder would cleanse the churn, not kill. She said she believed him because she wanted to believe anyone who offered her comfort. Miss Marple looked at her without judgment. She said belief can be as dangerous as deceit when it blinds the heart. Cray took the paper and sealed it in his case. He thanked Miss Marple for her patience. He said her notes had made the pattern clear. As they stepped into the lane, the air smelled of turned earth. The sky had cleared to a clean blue. Cray said the chemist would face trial. The grocer's role would also be examined. The girl, Nora, he promised, would be protected. Miss Marple nodded. She said truth ripens slowly but always reaches harvest. She said the village would heal once the talk turned from blame to understanding. They paused by the green. Children played with hoops, their laughter free again. Elsie passed with her milk pail, smiling shyly at Miss Marple. Peace had begun to seep back into the day. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window and opened her small notebook. She drew a neat line under her last entry. Beside it, she wrote 4 words: justice, patience, and small mercies. She placed the notebook away and picked up her knitting. The rhythm steadied her thoughts. The world, though fragile, had righted itself again. Outside, swallows dipped low across the garden. Their wings caught the sun in quick flashes. The air felt light, the way it always did when truth had found its voice. Clue 2 of the dusk came not from evidence, but from peace. Wrong had been faced, hearts had been freed, and Miss Marple's quiet wisdom had done its work. The kettle began to hum. She rose, poured her tea, and smiled faintly. Tomorrow would bring its ordinary cares again, letters to answer, roses to prune, and perhaps a visit from the vicar's wife. Chapter 8. The truth in the cream. Morning sunlight spilled gently across St. Mary Mead. The church bells rang in steady measure, calm and bright. Villagers gathered near the vicarage, speaking softly. Word had spread that Inspector Cray would announce the findings of the investigation. Miss Marple arrived with her usual quiet grace. She wore a pale blue hat and carried her knitting bag. The vicar greeted her warmly and led her toward the garden, where chairs had been set for those who wished to listen. Mr. Giles stood near the gate, pale and rigid. His eyes avoided every gaze. 2 constables waited behind him. Mrs. Price Ridley sat inside the vicarage, too ashamed to appear. Nora waited near the door, her face calm now, but tired. Inspector Cray cleared his throat. He spoke without flourish. He said that the evidence showed the chemist, Mr. Giles, had prepared and concealed a poisonous substance beneath the dairy churn. He had done so to ruin Mrs. Pargeter's trade and reclaim contracts lost through jealousy. A murmur passed through the crowd. Cray lifted his hand for quiet. He said the poison had been mixed into the butter fat through the churn's rim using a sealed vial. He explained that the vial, the label fragments, and the ledger notes all bore the chemist's mark. Miss Marple listened, eyes thoughtful. She noticed how the sunlight caught the churn displayed nearby, gleaming with false innocence. A symbol of labor turned briefly into an instrument of death. Clue 1 of the morning stood not in words, but in the churn itself, shining like repentance. Cray continued. He said the grocer had assisted in passing small sums of money to Mrs. Price Ridley. He would face charges of aiding concealment. Nora, he added, had come forward early and truthfully. Her honesty had lightened the path to justice. The villagers nodded. Some whispered prayers. Others frowned and looked away, unwilling to meet one another's eyes. It was hard to learn that a neighbour's ambition had become a weapon. Miss Marple rose and asked gently whether she might speak. Cray nodded. She said the village must remember that evil seldom enters as a stranger. It comes wearing a familiar smile, asking for small favours, borrowing trust. She said kindness without discernment can be as perilous as cruelty. Her words fell softly, yet the crowd stood still, listening. Even the birds paused in the hedges. When she finished, the air seemed lighter, as if the truth itself had drawn a long-needed breath. Mr. Giles spoke at last. His voice cracked like brittle glass. He said he never meant murder, only disgrace. He said a man mocked by the world finds strange comfort in revenge. The constables led him away. Clue 2 of the morning came through his confession. Pride that mistook humiliation for injustice and found its cure in malice. The gathering ended. People drifted back toward their cottages. The vicar shook Miss Marple's hand. He said justice had been served. She smiled gently and said justice is never an ending, only a balance restored. That afternoon, peace began to settle over St. Mary Mead. The sky turned soft and blue. Laundry fluttered on lines. Children played near the green once more. Miss Marple sat by her cottage window. On the table lay the churn handle Inspector Cray had returned to her, a token of the case now closed. She examined it, her fingers tracing the worn wood. She thought of Mrs. Pargeter, steady and kind, who had worked honestly and died for another's envy. She thought of Nora, who had learned courage the hard way. And she thought of the small vial hidden beneath layers of cream, patient as guilt. Clue 1 of reflection lived in her thoughts. How every mystery begins with a small human fault. Overlooked and allowed to grow, a knock came at her door. It was Elsie, carrying a basket wrapped in linen. She said the villagers had sent new butter from the dairy, made fresh under her care. She asked Miss Marple to taste the first batch. Miss Marple smiled and thanked her. She spread a little on bread, tasted, and nodded. The flavour was clean, bright, and pure. She told Elsie it was excellent work. The girl's eyes shone with relief. Inspector Cray arrived soon after, carrying his hat respectfully. He said the case was concluded, the statement signed. He asked whether Miss Marple ever tired of such matters. She said quietly that one cannot tire of watching people. Each case, she added, is only a mirror turned to human nature. We see the same motives, only dressed in new clothes. He smiled, tipping his hat. He said the constables called her the village's best detective. She laughed softly and said she was only an old woman who listened more than she spoke. They took tea together in the garden. Bees hummed around the lavender, and the kettle steamed gently. The afternoon light lay warm upon the path. Cray asked what she had thought first when she tasted the bitter butter that morning so long ago. Miss Marple said she remembered a single scent, almond behind cream, and she had known patience would lead her the rest of the way. Clue 2 of reflection glowed within that scent. Truth often hides in the faintest traces, waiting for calm minds to notice. When Cray left, Miss Marple sat alone. She listened to the hum of the bees and the far-off chime of the church clock. Peace had returned, though its cost had been dearly earned. She picked up her knitting. The yarn moved between her fingers, steady and sure. She thought of all the small wrongs that pass unseen, and how often they begin in pride, loneliness, or fear. As evening fell, she placed her knitting aside and lit a candle. Its flame flickered once, then burned true. The house seemed to breathe in quiet contentment. Clue 3 of the evening burned there in that steady flame. Truth, once found, needs only gentleness to keep its light alive. Outside, night gathered softly over the village. Windows glowed like low stars. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. Miss Marple drew her curtains and whispered a brief prayer for the souls of the wronged and the foolish alike. Then she smiled, for peace had indeed returned. And so, dear listener, Miss Marple and the Poison in the Butter Churn draws to its quiet close. The candle's flame is steady once more, its light falling softly on truth revealed. In St. Mary Mead, peace returns, and Miss Marple's knitting resumes, each stitch a reflection on the tangled hearts of humankind. Until next time, dear listener, another secret fades by candlelight.